Miami has always sold a promise. Endless sun, fast money, sculpted bodies, luxury cars, and lives that look like they were pulled straight from glossy magazines. But behind that polished surface, in the early 1990s, there was another Miami, one driven by obsession, unchecked ambition, and a dangerous belief that success was something you could simply take. It was in this environment that one of the most disturbing crime stories in Florida's history began. Not in dark alleys or hidden clubs, but inside a gym. The story begins at the Sandin Gym, a place that was supposed to represent discipline, health, and self-improvement. The gym was run by John M., a former bodybuilder who dreamed of turning it into a major hub for the bodybuilding world. But big dreams, when mixed with poor judgment and no ethical foundation, tend to attract the wrong kind of people. The Sandin Gym slowly became more than a place to train. It became a breeding ground for frustration, delusion, and criminal thinking. Among its regulars was Daniel Lugo, a former convict, physically imposing, charismatic, and deeply convinced that he was destined for greatness. Lugo did not see himself as a criminal. In his mind, he was a man temporarily delayed from achieving the life he deserved. His language was filled with distorted motivational quotes, self-help ideas taken to extremes, and a firm belief that wealth was not earned. It was owed. Daniel Lugo divided the world into winners and losers, and he was determined to never be on the losing side. But winning, to him, did not mean patience, effort, or legitimate work. Winning meant taking, forcing reality to bend to his will. At the gym, he met Noel Dorbel, another man consumed by the same hunger for money, power, and status. Dorbel shared Lugo's mindset. Physical strength equaled authority, intimidation was strategy, and morality was weakness. Together they began forming what looked like a loose group of misguided friends, but in reality it was the foundation of a violent and reckless criminal gang, driven by envy and entitlement. Their first major target was Mark Schiller. Schiller represented everything Daniel Lugo believed had been unfairly denied to him. He was wealthy, successful, and comfortable, a walking symbol of the life Lugo felt entitled to. In Lugo's twisted logic, stealing from Schiller wasn't a crime, it was justice. The kidnapping was poorly planned, but executed with shocking brutality. Mark Schiller was ambushed, restrained, and taken to a location where he was held under constant control. Over several days, he was subjected to repeated physical abuse, psychological threats, and deliberate humiliation designed to break his resistance. His vision was severely damaged after his eyes were tightly taped for extended periods, and sensory deprivation was used to keep him disoriented and powerless. Under relentless pressure, Schiller was forced to sign documents transferring his money, properties, and assets to the gang. They believed that once the paperwork was complete, the problem was solved. But instead of walking away, paranoia took over. Even after taking nearly everything Schiller owned, the gang began to see him as a living threat. Someone who could talk. Someone who could survive. From that moment on, the plan escalated from extortion to elimination. What followed was a series of failed murder attempts that border on the unbelievable. Schiller was deliberately run over, his car was set on fire, and crude attempts were made to cause fatal accidents. In fiction, this would feel exaggerated. In reality, it was sheer luck. Against all odds, Mark Schiller survived. Severely injured and traumatized, he managed to escape, seek help, and report the crimes to authorities. And for the first time, Daniel Lugo lost control of the story he thought he was writing. Instead of retreating, the gang spiraled further into violence. Soon after, they targeted Frank Griga, a wealthy businessman. This time, the approach was manipulation rather than force. a fake business opportunity was created, something too attractive to ignore. Frank Griga and his fiancée, Christina Furton, were lured into a meeting, unaware they were stepping into a fatal trap. The encounter quickly turned violent. What was meant to be intimidation escalated into uncontrolled aggression. Frank Griga was beaten until he could no longer survive. Christina, an unwilling witness, was also killed. What followed marked the case as one of the most horrifying in Miami's criminal history. In a desperate and chaotic attempt to erase evidence, the gang resorted to crude methods. The bodies were concealed, dismembered, burned, and hidden in barrels. Nothing about the process was calculated or effective. It only produced more mistakes, more evidence, and more questions. As investigations intensified, survivors' testimonies, physical evidence, and witness statements began to align. Daniel Lugo was no longer an anonymous gym member with big dreams. He was identified as the leader of a gang responsible for kidnapping, extortion, murder, and concealment of bodies. The trial that followed became one of the longest and most expensive in Florida's history. The defense attempted to portray Lugo and his accomplices as confused men influenced by drugs, extreme fitness culture, and distorted motivational thinking. But the facts were overwhelming. The violence was systematic. The intent was clear. Daniel Lugo and Noel Durbal were sentenced to life in prison. Other accomplices received varying sentences based on their involvement. The fantasy of fast wealth ended behind prison walls. Years later, the case re-entered public consciousness through the film Pain and Gain, which portrayed the events as an exaggerated mix of comedy and action. While loosely based on real events, the movie softened the psychological horror and turned real criminals into caricatures. For many, it raised uncomfortable questions about how true crime is consumed and portrayed. Because the reality was far darker than any cinematic version, the Daniel Lugo case stands as a chilling warning about what happens when ambition loses all boundaries, when entitlement replaces empathy, when motivational slogans become excuses for violence. This was not just a crime story. It was a collision between delusion and reality, with devastating consequences. And perhaps the most disturbing truth is this: none of it began with hatred. It began with envy, with comparison, with the refusal to accept an ordinary life. If stories like this still need to be told, it's because there are still people who believe the world owes them everything. And when that belief meets opportunity, the results can be catastrophic. If you want to continue exploring real cases told with depth, darkness, and respect for the victims, subscribe to Open Case Files and stay with us for the next episodes. Some stories aren't just about crime. They're about who we become when ambition speaks louder than conscience. And the question that lingers is simple: how far would someone go to avoid accepting an ordinary life? How far would someone go to avoid accepting an ordinary life? In the case of Daniel Lugo, the answer is uncomfortable because it is not abstract. It is documented. It is measured in broken bones, stolen identities, destroyed families, and lives permanently altered. Lugo's story forces us to confront a truth that society rarely wants to face. Extreme violence does not always come from rage or desperation. Sometimes it comes from ambition stripped of limits. Daniel Lugo did not see himself as a villain. That belief is critical to understanding everything that followed. In his own mind, he was the hero of the story, temporarily misunderstood, unfairly delayed by a system that rewarded the wrong people. He absorbed motivational language the way others absorb religion, repeating phrases about success, dominance, and destiny without understanding their meaning. Hard work was replaced with shortcuts. Ethics were replaced with entitlement, and responsibility was replaced with blame. What makes his case so disturbing is how ordinary the beginning truly was. A gym, a group of men talking about money, complaints about unfairness, fantasies of wealth. These are conversations that happen everywhere. The difference is not the desire itself, but the point at which desire becomes justification. At some moment, Daniel Lugo crossed a line where other people stopped being human beings and became obstacles, assets, targets. Once that line is crossed, everything else becomes easier. Violence no longer feels like a moral decision. It becomes a tool. Deception becomes strategy. Loyalty becomes conditional. And fear becomes currency. This is how criminal logic replaces human logic. Not all at once, but step by step, rationalization by rationalization, until the final act feels inevitable instead of unthinkable. Mark Schiller survived, but survival does not mean escape. His life after the crimes was marked by trauma, legal battles, and the knowledge that his suffering was treated by some as entertainment years later. Frank Griga and Christina Furton never had the chance to rebuild anything. Their names are often mentioned briefly, overshadowed by the spectacle of the crime itself. This is another quiet injustice of true crime. The perpetrators become infamous, while the victims are reduced to footnotes. The legal system eventually intervened, but only after irreversible damage had been done. Investigators uncovered a pattern of arrogance and incompetence that was almost as shocking as the violence itself. These were not criminal masterminds. They were reckless men who believed strength made them untouchable. Their downfall did not come from intelligence or remorse, but from their inability to control their own impulses. During the trial, Daniel Lugo showed little genuine accountability. His statements reflected resentment rather than regret. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence, he clung to the idea that he had been misunderstood, manipulated, or unfairly portrayed. This refusal to accept responsibility is not unique to him. It is a recurring trait among individuals who build their identity around entitlement. And then there is the cultural afterlife of the case. When Pain and Gain was released, many viewers were shocked to learn that the story was inspired by real events. The film framed the crimes with dark humor and exaggerated absurdity, presenting the perpetrators as foolish rather than terrifying. For some, it was entertainment. For others, it felt like a betrayal. The real story was not absurd. It was grim, methodical, and devastating. This raises a deeper question. What happens when real violence is repackaged as spectacle? When criminals are remembered more vividly than their victims? When moral boundaries blur in the name of entertainment? The Daniel Lugo case sits uncomfortably at that intersection, where reality and fiction collide, and truth becomes distorted. But beyond media, beyond courtrooms, beyond movies, the most important lesson of this case lies in its psychology. Daniel Lugo was not born violent. He was not raised to be a killer. He was shaped by an environment that equated worth with wealth, masculinity with dominance, and success with visibility. When those ideals collide with insecurity and narcissism, the result can be explosive. This is not an excuse. It is a warning. Because the conditions that created this case did not disappear with the verdict. They exist wherever success is portrayed as mandatory, failure as shameful, and ordinary life as unacceptable. They exist in spaces where motivation turns into obsession and ambition turns into justification. They exist wherever people are taught that they deserve more than they are willing to earn. The Daniel Lugo story is not just about crime, it is about illusion. The illusion that shortcuts lead somewhere safe. The illusion that power replaces accountability. The illusion that identity can be built on envy without consequences. In the end, Daniel Lugo did not escape an ordinary life. He traded it for a permanent cage. Noel Doorbal did the same. The wealth they dreamed of never existed. The status they craved evaporated the moment reality intervened. All that remained was damage, measurable, irreversible, and real. And this is where the story truly ends, not with a sentence or a headline, but with a question that extends far beyond this case. How many people are quietly crossing that same line today? At what point does desire turn into entitlement? And how often do we mistake ambition for virtue? If you want to continue exploring cases where human psychology, crime, and consequence collide, subscribe to Open Case Files and stay with us for the next episodes. These stories are not told to glorify darkness, but to expose it slowly, honestly, and without shortcuts. Because some crimes are not born in hatred, they are born in the refusal to accept reality. And once that refusal takes root, the cost is never paid by just one person.